You may or may not have heard of the World Trade Organization, the global body that is supposed to set the rules for global trade. That means to create the rules by which states need to abide when exporting and importing goods and services, when trading with others. Now, in recent years, the WTO has found itself in serious problems. Perhaps most importantly, it is increasingly clear that it is today unable to formulate new rules for global trade that all member states could agree upon. For more than 15 years now, the members have tried to reach an agreement within the so-called Doha Development Agenda, or the Doha round of trade liberalization talks, unsuccessfully. In our research with a colleague of mine, Matthew Stephen, we try to look at some of the reasons for that failure. Here is what we found. First, in the last decades and years, global economy has seen a major power shift, especially with the rise of China, Brazil, India and some other countries into positions of important trading powers. What these countries bring with themselves are distinct views on how the global trade should be organized. Views sometimes quite far from the perspectives of the so-called established powers, such as the United States, the EU and Japan, members of the so-called G7 or Group of Seven. In general, the rising powers, sometimes referred to shortly as BRICS, for Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, adopt less liberal positions towards international trade than the established powers. Now, recent policy shifts within the United States may change this a bit, but in the long term, the established powers tend to adopt overall more open approaches to international trade. For instance, in the form of lower tariff protection of their markets. What we find, though, is that the major differences may not be in the traditional, classical areas of trade negotiations, such as industrial tariffs, agriculture and services. Instead, we find that the really important, prominent differences lie in the new, so-called deep integration agenda. These areas do not have to do with trade barriers at the border of the states, but with the so-called behind-the-border protection. These are various domestic regulatory frameworks, including, for example, technical and health and sanitary regulations. These are administrative demands on imports, government subsidies, but also such agendas as government procurement, the protection of investment, or competition policy. The established powers, who seek liberalization in these areas, argue that across all these domestic agendas, states should behave in non-discriminatory ways, treating foreign firms equally as theirs. And they want to create rules that would enforce that. In contrast, the rising powers, such as China and other BRICS, adopt much more cautious approaches to these matters. They fear the possible interference of the WTO into their domestic affairs. They run, domestically, what is often called state capitalist systems. That means broadly capitalist economies, but with a very heavy involvement of the state in how exactly the economy operates. Right? They often provide sizable financial support to their national champions. The state owns and runs a lot of major enterprises. The governments, in general, seek heavy control of the economy. Now, this is nicely summarized in this graph, which shows the values of the Product Market Regulation Index and the State Control Index, as calculated by OECD. This index measures the degree of the involvement of states in their economies. The BRICS countries are marked in green, the G7 countries are marked in blue. Now, the differences between the groups are sizable, as you can see. In the BRICS countries, states and politics are significantly more involved in the economies than in the G7 countries, the established powers, if you will. Of course, the rising powers are then opposed to the creation of new rules in these deep integration areas. Such rules would be in a direct conflict with how they are used to run their economies. In other words, these new rules would not only have some economic implications for rising powers, whether positive or negative. More importantly, they would collide with the basic underlying domestic structures of their economies and politics. They would prevent the governments from operating their economies the ways they are used to. What do we take out of this? It seems like, at least for now, the multilateral negotiations in the WTO, in the global trade regime, have hit the wall. We argue that the reason is not only conflictive business and economic interests of the state. In addition, we argue that the deadlock in the negotiations in the WTO reflects deeply ingrained structural differences between how economies are operated. Differences between the established powers, such as the G7 countries, and the BRICS. What results from this deadlock is an increasing irrelevance of the existing global trade rules. These rules, agreed upon in mid-1990s, reflect the state of the global economy of the 1980s and 1990s, not the economy of the second decade of the 21st century.